Hi everyone, and welcome to our fourth video cast of the personality unit. So, for the last video today, we're going to be focusing on a perspective called the trait perspective, right? So we've talked about the psychoanalytic, we talked about the social cognitive, we talked about the humanistic, and last but not least, we're going to talk about the trait perspective. And the reason I talk about the trait perspective last is because of this phrase, right? Not why, but what. So the idea with trait perspective is they don't really explain why or how you got your personality, but more what your personality consists of and how does the way that you behave signify what traits you do or do not have, right? So a trait is an individual's unique makeup of durable dispositions and consistent ways of behaving that constitute their personality. Examples of traits: honest, dependable, moody, impulsive, right? So what they want to figure out is how do we know what behaviors go with what traits in order to give you an accurate perception of what your traits are and what they're not. So the first guy to kind of go into this trait theory was Allport, right? That's his last name. And his goal was to define personality in terms of behavior patterns. So people who were moody tended to behave this way, or this way, right? And people, it was like a description and a way to classify people into certain categories. And Allport and his colleague in 1936 identified as much as 18,000 words that could represent a trait. So eventually they were able to cut this down to 200, and they had what was called like a cardinal trait and a secondary trait. So your cardinal trait would be like the one that identifies you the most, and then a secondary trait might be something like underneath it that you usually are, but not all the time. But still, ultimately, like 200 is still too much, right? So what they do and the way that they kind of made this, they condensed those traits is they use something called factor analysis. Factor analysis is a statistical approach that is used to describe and relate personality traits together. So what it does is it takes traits that are similar and combines them into a greater category. And Cattell, that's this guy here, used this approach to develop his 16 personality factor inventory, which is kind of based on Jung's ideas of like introversion, extroversion, thinking, feeling. It's kind of interesting. There's like a connection there. So, factor analysis, right? Cattell found that large groups of traits could be reduced down to 16 core personalities based on statistical correlations. So, for example, like a basic trait would be excitement, but then impulsive might be a part of excitable, or like impatient might be a part of excitable. So like other things would be part of a general larger category. Okay. Then Hans and Eysenck suggested that personality actually was not 16, it was just 3 polar dimensions, right? Extroversion, introversion. So are you outgoing or more like quiet? You know, you tend to like to be alone. And then emotional stability and instability. So this is like how, like, are you moody, anxious, like very aggressive, excitable, or are you more like leadership, calm, even-tempered, right? So you see the words that go along. And then they also talked about like having some sort of like psychotic disorder, but that was a personality trait. So that's what they kind of added in, right? And today what we use is, we thought that the Eysencks, 2 was too narrow and 16 was still too large. So of course, somebody came up with a new theory, right? A theory in the middle, and they call it the big 5 factors. That was Chloe for you. She was very eager for you to learn what these 5 factors are. So here's the 5 factors: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, introversion. So you see that came from the other theories, right? Agreeableness, and then emotional stability. So actually 2 of the categories are part of Eysencks also. They just added some. Okay. Now, remember, this spells ocean. So that's how you're going to remember what the 5 factors are: ocean. Okay, so you can either use the word canoe, which they show you here, or ocean. You do have to know all of them, and you do have to be able to identify, at least at a basic sense, what it means to be high or low. So conscientious people are organized, careful, and disciplined. High, low end, careless, and impulsive. If you're agreeable, you're trusting and helpful. If not, you're suspicious and uncooperative. So, right, it kind of makes sense. And this is not good or bad. It's just high or low. There's no, like, judgment. Neuroticism. So if you're high, or if you're low, you're calm, secure, and trusting. So if you have high emotional stability, or you're anxious, insecure, you have a lot of negative emotions. Openness. You're imaginative, independent, or practical and conforming. Extroversion. You're sociable and affectionate, or you're retiring, sober, and kind of more reserved. Okay, so I want you to try to think about, just based on what I just told you, where do you think you would be on this scale? Okay, and we'll talk about this more in class, right? So here's a couple questions about the big five. How stable are they? They're supposed to be quite stable, and they can change, but once you get to adulthood, they're pretty much solid, right? How heritable are they? So it's 50% or so is based on your biology, right? It's really why they don't bother explaining, because they say a lot of it's your parents, right? These traits are common across cultures. And they tend to predict other things. So conscientious people are morning types, and extroverted are evening types. So they tend to predict other things about you, right? So it describes you as a person as a whole, okay? And there's a little bit of controversy with this because Michelle points out that traits might be enduring, but the behavior might be different based on the situation. So it's not really a good predictor of your behavior. So while you might have the trait, you might like hide the trait in a certain situation, and so they're not actually describing your behavior very well. And the explanation for this, or the comeback, right, was that they argue that behaviors from a situation might be different, but the average behavior remains the same. So although I might behave slightly differently in each situation, my average behavior choice is the same, and therefore traits matter. So this is their way of being treated, right, to that people coming back at their theory. Okay, so read this quote, and it talks a lot about rooms, right, and how the place where you sleep tells a lot about your personality. So what I'd like to do is an experiment with Facebook, and I'll talk more about it in class, okay, but this kind of gets to the heart of why I want to do it. So that's all for now, AP Psychos, and remember, psychology is flippin' awesome.